She didn't cry. Not on the plane. Not in the terminal. Not even in the back seat of the Uber that took her home that night. Because when you've spent your whole life being told subtly, politely, and sometimes bluntly that you're probably in the wrong room, you learn to hold it in. Her name was on the ticket. Her seat was printed in bold. And yet, when she stood in front of seat 9C, all it took was a glance at her hoodie, her curls, her skin for someone to decide she didn't belong. No one yelled. No one swore. But silence. That kind of silence. It cuts deeper than words. This is not a story about a boarding pass. This is a story about the quiet ways dignity gets dismissed, and the one woman who decided, just once, not to step aside. So what happens when a system built on appearance gets disrupted by presence? You're about to find out. The plane was cold, not in temperature but in tone. Amara Tilley stepped into the cabin of Flight LT Nate, 104, from Denver to Charlotte with her head slightly bowed, shoulders relaxed, and her leather carry-on pressed against her hip like a shield. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this before, gate to seat, aisle to window, nothing new, nothing worth remembering. Until today. She had just finished delivering the keynote address at the National Tech Innovators Summit, a standing ovation, a LinkedIn flood. Her face on stage beside a banner that read, "The future is written by those who dare to code it." She had dared, she had written, and now all she wanted was to get home. Row 9, seat C, aisle seat, business select. She picked it weeks ago. She liked the freedom of quick exits. But somewhere, between stepping onto the plane and reaching that row, something shifted. She didn't see it, but she felt it. The way the flight attendant's eyes locked onto her before she even got past row 4. The sudden stiffness in the older white woman, seated at 8B. The tight smile from the man in 9A. A crisp blazer, copy of the Wall Street Journal, folded precisely on his lap. Something invisible moved ahead of her, like a fog made of assumptions. Amara walked on. She wore a black hoodie, soft and clean, with subtle thumbholes at the sleeves, high-waisted jeans, no jewelry except for the silver ring her late mother once wore. Her hair was tied in a low puff. Neat, natural, simple. Her sneakers were white, worn at the soles, but spotless. At row 9, she slowed, slid her boarding pass from her phone's wallet, and double-checked. Seat 9C, Tilley, A, priority flex. Right row, right seat, right name. She stepped into the aisle, angled to sit, and that's when it happened. A voice, firm and oddly personal, sliced through the cabin. "Ma'am, I think you may be in the wrong seat." Amara looked up. The flight attendant, blonde bun, blazer crisp with brass button, stood, with one hand extended like a stop sign. Her name tag read, Marla. Her smile didn't touch her eyes. "I don't believe I am," Amara said, soft but even. She showed her screen. Marla barely glanced at it before her brows pulled together. I don't have you listed in Business Select." It was the tone more than the words, as if she were doing Amara a favor by even pretending to check. As if the screen in Amara's hand wasn't enough. Behind her, the line backed up, the shuffle of feet. Someone sighed. Then came another voice, casual but pointed, from the man in 9A, still folding his paper. Maybe she grabbed the wrong boarding group. No name, no accusation, just implication. Amara looked at him, held his gaze longer than he expected. He looked away first. "Please step aside," Marla said. "We'll sort it once everyone's seated." Amara didn't move, not yet. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago, direct from the Skylux app." "Of course, but we've had booking errors today, glitches," Marla replied. "We'll figure it out. Just if you could wait in the back until we confirm." Another sigh, this time louder, 2 rows back. And in that moment, Amara felt her skin not as protection, but as target. Not one person had asked for her name. Not one had looked beyond her hoodie. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. Sure. She stepped back, and someone else, slid into her place. She moved past row 10, past 15, and kept walking until the rows felt cramped and the windows smaller. She sat in a middle seat near the rear lavatory. The armrest was broken. The light above her flickered. She stared straight ahead. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But something in her, something small and whole, curled inward. The boarding announcement continued, like nothing had happened. Welcome aboard Skylux 804, service to Charlotte. Flight time is approximately 2 hours and 25 minutes. The words bounced meaninglessly off the walls. To most, this was nothing. A minor seat mix-up, a clerical glitch. But to Amara, it wasn't the first time she'd been told to wait her turn in a room she'd already earned entry into. When she was 11, her science fair poster was removed from the finalist wall because a judge thought it too advanced to have been hers. At 15, her debate coach told her to soften her tone so she wouldn't seem threatening. At 22, a coworker asked who she was interning for after she'd just been introduced as lead developer. She had long learned that excellence didn't shield you. That credentials didn't silence suspicion. That brilliance, when worn on brown skin, often came with asterisks. Her fingers brushed the silver ring. Her mother, Marlene, used to say, "You'll walk into rooms where you're the first, baby, but never let them make you feel like you're the mistake." But now, here, in 33E, beside a coughing teenager and a crying baby, she wondered, was she the mistake? The captain's voice crackled through. "Ladies and gentlemen, final boarding is complete. Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff." Marla never came back. No one checked her pass again. No one verified the manifest. The plane lifted off. And in that moment, Amara felt not rage, not sadness, just a kind of numbness that came from being invisible in plain sight. No one had said, "You don't belong here." But everything about the moment had whispered it. She didn't ask to switch back, didn't speak to anyone, didn't open her laptop. She just sat there, somewhere above Colorado, holding her silence like it was the only thing that still belonged to her. The plane leveled out at 32,000 feet. The captain said something about smooth skies ahead, but for Amara, there was nothing smooth about where she sat. She shifted in her seat slightly. Her knees brushed against the tray table, her elbows tucked in, out of habit, like someone trying not to take up space. The air vent above her hissed faintly. She adjusted it, not to change the airflow, but to distract her fingers. Around her, the hum of the cabin, snack wrappers, seatbelt clicks, the low drone of engines. The crying baby had finally quieted, but the ringing in her ears hadn't. She scrolled her phone with no purpose, opened a messaging app, typed 2 words to Naomi. It happened. Then she stared at the blinking cursor, added 2 more. Again. Then hit send. No emojis, no need. Naomi would know exactly what it meant. The context was never about the event, it was about the feeling, the pattern, the knowing. It wasn't just about being told to sit somewhere else. It was about the way no one questioned it, the way the air went heavy the moment she entered the cabin, the way the attendant didn't even look at her name before assuming something was off, the way the man next to 9C had said, maybe she grabbed the wrong boarding group, like it was a reasonable guess. She had walked on that plane as a keynote speaker, an engineer, a builder of systems so complex even her team sometimes struggled to keep up. But the moment she stepped into that aisle wearing a hoodie and a natural puff, she became someone else to them. Someone less. And that was the part that stung, not the downgrade, not the inconvenience, but the quiet agreement between strangers that she must not belong. Amara exhaled slowly and looked out the window. She could see nothing, just darkness and the distant glow of a city beneath them, maybe Omaha, maybe Kansas City, somewhere she'd once passed through on a connecting flight. Somewhere she'd once been asked, politely, if she was with the cleaning crew while waiting for her own gate to open. Back then, she'd laughed it off, said something clever, even thanked the woman for checking in, but that laughter had cost her something, something small. something no one else could measure. Her mother used to say, "We pay the tax of assumption every day. Doesn't matter how high we climb, that tax is due on sight." And today, Amara had paid it again, with silence. She leaned back, pulled her hood halfway up, and let her mind drift not to the incident, but to the 1,000 tiny moments that shaped her ability to endure it. When she was 17, she'd been invited to tour MIT's campus as a finalist in a national coding competition. It was a big D-loan of only 4 black girls out of nearly 80 students. On the second day, a professor asked her where she was transferring from, assuming she must be community college. When she said she was still in high school, his eyebrows lifted like she'd performed a trick. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the surprise, the implication that brilliance must be rare in someone who looked like her. At 23, after her first major system design launched, her name was left off the company's press release. Her male supervisor apologized and told her it was a formatting issue, that it wasn't personal, but it always felt personal, even when it wasn't intended to be. Even when people said, "You're reading too much into it." Even when friends whispered, "At least you got the job. At least you were in the room." She had always been in the room. She had built the room. But still, there was always someone checking her badge at the door. This time, it had just been a boarding pass. A name, a seat, a row, a glitch, they said. But how quickly that glitch became a question of whether she belonged. How smoothly the human error became personal doubt. Because the truth wasn't that she had been moved. The truth was that no one had moved to correct it. As the plane cruised toward Charlotte, Amara noticed a flight attendant approaching with the drink cart. It wasn't Marla. It was someone younger, Latina, maybe mid-20s, with warm eyes and soft features. She paused at Amara's row. "Hi there. Can I offer you something to drink?" Amara looked up, momentarily unsure. "Water's fine," she said. The attendant poured from the bottle and handed her a small cup. Then, in a lower voice, she added, "I saw what happened earlier. Just so you know, you weren't wrong." Amara blinked. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," she said finally. The attendant gave a faint nod like someone who had wanted to say more, but couldn't. And then she pushed the cart forward, row by row, leaving behind the thinnest trace of solidarity. A whisper, a crack in the silence. Amara turned the cup in her hands slowly, watching the condensation drip down the side. That moment, small and almost private, landed heavier than it should have. Because she hadn't realized until then how alone she'd felt, how much she had internalized the quietlet it hardened into self-control. That flight attendant hadn't fixed anything. She hadn't pulled rank, hadn't made a scene, but she'd seen Amara, and in doing so, had reminded her she wasn't invisible to everyone. Later, when the cabin lights dimmed and passengers began to doze off, Amara stared at the seat back in front of her. She thought about the man in 9A, the one who hadn't even looked at her when he made his comment. She thought about Marla, who had spoken with such certainty and such ease, like she'd done this 100 times and never been challenged. She wondered how many people had simply accepted that kind of dismissal, quietly, alone, with no drink cart solidarity, no whispered, "You weren't wrong." How many had folded their tickets and sat in silence, never to speak of it again? Amara clenched her jaw slightly. She had always believed in process, in systems, in building logic that created fairness. But systems didn't fix what they refused to see. And what she had felt today, what she was still feeling, was something that no system had prepared her to process. The captain announced their descent. The lights brightened. The hum of conversation returned. She gathered her things with steady hands. She didn't look back toward row 9, didn't try to reclaim the seat, didn't demand an apology. Not yet. But in her chest, something new had started to stir. Not anger, not vengeance. Conviction, a quiet refusal to carry the silence any further. As the plane touched down and rolled toward the gate, Amara looked out the window again. Charlotte lights blinked in a slow pattern across the tarmac. The city didn't know her name, but she had a sense it would. Not because she wanted attention, but because something needed to change. And sometimes, the only way to break the cycle was to stop walking past it, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's subtle, even when no one else says a word. Especially then, the wheels touched down with a soft screech. Passengers shifted. Phones lit up. Seatbelts clicked open prematurely. Amara stayed seated, her bag zipped, her spine straight. She wasn't in a rush anymore. Not to get off the plane. Not to outrun what had just happened. The overhead chime rang. A polite announcement followed. "Welcome to Charlotte. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we've reached the gate." As the plane taxied, she opened her email not to check work, but to document. She wrote a subject line to herself. Incident, Flight LT Night 104. And beneath it, time, date, flight number. Then, denied assigned seat, no verification. Moved without consent, no apology. She didn't know what she would do with the note yet, but she needed it down, in writing, in her own words. Truth written down was harder to deny. As the plane came to a full stop, and the chime rang again, passengers stood quickly, their collective urgency to exit palpable. Some were already tugging bags from overhead bins. The man from 9, a crisp blazer, efficient was among them, standing tall with his phone to his ear. "Yeah, just landed. Flight was fine. No, not too late. I'll be out in 5. He didn't glance back. The young flight attendant from earlier approached Amara's row again. Her expression was unreadable now. Tired, maybe. Cautious. Amara looked up, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then the attendant said softly, Would you mind staying seated a moment?" Amara narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "There's someone who asked to speak to you." Before Amara could respond, a calm voice floated down the aisle, deliberate and strong. "I asked." From further up the plane, a woman in her late 50s stepped into view. Gray curls, pressed navy slacks, soft brown skin, and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. Amara recognized her instantly. Dr. Renee Dawson, legal ethics professor, former federal mediator, contributor to the FAA's Passenger Equity Board. She'd seen her on a panel last year, quiet, precise, powerful. A woman who spoke not often, but always with weight. "I was seated in row 11, Renee said. "I saw what happened." The plane had quieted around them. Passengers still hovered, bags in hand, frozen in that awkward in-between of being ready to leave but unsure if they should watch. Amara blinked. "You saw it?" Renee nodded once, every second. There was no accusation in her tone, just observation, precision. Amara's throat was suddenly dry. I didn't say anything," she confessed. "You didn't need to," Renee replied. "But I do." She turned toward the front of the plane and raised her voice slightly, not loud, just enough. "Is the lead flight attendant still on board?" Marla reappeared from the galley, her smile now clearly performative. "Yes, ma'am? I'd like to speak with you, right here, in front of Miss Tilly." Marla hesitated. "Of course, what seems to be the issue?" "The issue," Renee said, stepping forward, "is that a paying passenger was removed from her assigned seat without proper verification. She was displaced based on visual assessment and assumption. No ID check, no manifest confirmation, and not a single apology." Renee's voice didn't shake, it didn't rise, but the cabin had gone completely still. Even the man in 9A had lowered his phone. Marla folded her arms. There was a system glitch. Her name didn't show. "Did you check the printed manifest?" "The tablet had priority." "Then your procedure is flawed," Renee said, "or selectively enforced." Marla opened her mouth, closed it. Renee turned to Amara. "Do you have your boarding pass?" Amara pulled it up, hand slightly trembling, now not from fear, but something deeper. The rush of being defended, publicly, without warning. Renee looked at the screen. Seat 9C. Business select. Priority flex. Confirmed. Time-stamped. Barcode. Then she looked at Marla again. I will be filing a report with Skylux's ethics board and FAA oversight, and I strongly recommend you do not attempt to reframe this as a misunderstanding. I didn't mean, Marla began. Renee cut in gently. You didn't have to mean it. You simply did it. Behind them, a few passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. One man, maybe early 30s, spoke up from row 7. I saw it too, he said. She was treated like she didn't belong. It was obvious. A woman behind him added, I thought it looked wrong, but I didn't want to get involved. Another voice, she handled it better than most would. Renee turned again. Amara, may I call you that? Amara nodded slowly. Would you like to return to your seat? Row 9C? Amara hesitated. It would be easy to say no, to wave it off, to shrink. But this wasn't about the seat. It never was. It was about not disappearing. She stood, straightened her hoodie, slung her bag over her shoulder. Yes, I would. The aisle opened like a corridor. People stepped astronaut reluctantly, but intentionally. Some nodded. One woman reached out briefly and touched Amara's forearm, didn't say a word. Amara walked forward with Renee beside her. When they reached row 9, the man in 9A stood, slowly, awkwardly. I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier, he mumbled. Amara looked at him, not angry, not sharp, just clear. I know exactly what you meant. He sat back down. No further words. Amara slid into 9C. The seat felt the same, but she did not. As passengers began to deplane, Renee stood in the aisle, waiting. Marla had retreated. The young attendant gave a faint smile as she passed. The man from row 7 stopped and turned back toward Amara. If you ever want someone to back your complaint up, he said, you've got me. She nodded. Thank you. When the plane finally emptied, Amara remained in her seat. Renee sat beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Amara whispered, Why did you step in? Renee turned her head, eyes soft. Because when I was your age, no one did. Amara stared at the tray table, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. I didn't plan to speak up, she admitted. I was just going to let it go. Renee nodded. That's what they count on. Outside, the gate lights blurred against the window. The flight was officially complete, but something far more important had just taken off. Amara pulled her phone from her pocket, opened her note, and added a new line beneath the incident report. A woman stood up. For me. With me. And it changed everything. Amara didn't cry when she got off the plane. She didn't collapse in the terminal, or crumble in the rideshare, or call Naomi in the middle of the night to unload it all. She just went home, brushed her teeth, took her hoodie off with calm hands, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the blinking light of the charging cable like it was the only thing in the room still tethered to something solid. Then she opened her laptop and wrote the truth down. Not in rage, not in hashtags, just the facts line by line. She wrote about the boarding pass, the assigned seat, the flight attendant's refusal to verify before relocating her. She wrote about the silence that followed, the ache of being watched but not seen. And then she wrote about Renee Dawson, about a woman who stepped forward with precision and grace, and about how that moment changed more than her Seattle changed her. She didn't post it publicly, not yet. She just saved it in a folder titled, Not Forgotten. Then she went to bed, exhaled slowly, and let this stillness wrap around her like a quiet form of armor. The next morning, she made coffee, tied her hair up, and opened a clean document. But this time, it wasn't a recounting of what happened. It was a letter, a formal one, to Skylux Airlines. Subject, Passenger Experience Complaint. Flight, LT Night, 104. She attached screenshots, the boarding pass, her seat assignment, a time-stamped summary of events. She wrote with restraint, but not with softness. At the end, she added a paragraph that didn't ask for compensation, a voucher, or a discount. It asked for change. I am not writing this as a victim. I am writing this as a system architect. And what I saw wasn't just bad judgment, it was a failure of design. Your current boarding and verification protocol leaves too much room for bias. If you want to protect your passengers, you have to start where your assumptions begin. She hit send. And for the first time since the incident, she smiled. Not wide, but honest. 2 days passed, then 5, then a week. The reply came from Skylux's Executive Experience Division. It thanked her. It said they were reviewing, that they appreciated her input, and would follow up once the matter had been fully investigated. It was polished, polite, carefully non-committal. But Amara didn't feel dismissed. Because this time she wasn't waiting for their validation. She had already moved forward. Renee Dawson called her 3 days after the letter went out. I just got off the phone with one of the directors at Skylux, she said. They're listening. They said that? Amara asked. No, Renee replied. But I know the language they didn't use, and right now they're more worried about exposure than policy. But that can be turned into progressive, we do this right. Amara leaned back in her chair. What does right look like? It looks like you, Renee said, quiet, firm, and unignorable. What followed wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a viral tweet or a trending video. It was quieter than that. It started with a scheduled call between Amara and 2 internal executives at Skylux. Then a second call with their compliance liaison. Then a third this time with someone from their Passenger Experience Redesign Committee. Amara spoke not as the wrong passenger but as a builder, a problem solver, a systems thinker. They asked questions. She asked better ones. What's the verification protocol when names don't appear on the tablet manifest? How is staff trained to escalate without bias? What language is used during onboarding about appearance and perceived professionalism? And perhaps the most important question, what happens when the system fails and no one is filming? The conversations were long, careful, sometimes defensive, but slowly, something shifted. Because Amara didn't speak from anger. She spoke from clarity. And clarity, in rooms full of excuses, is disarming. By the 3rd week, Skylux had invited her to serve on a temporary advisory committee. She declined the offer. Instead, she proposed a different idea. I don't want a seat on a board that forgets me in 6 months, she said. I want a clause. A permanent procedural safeguard named after someone who was once made to feel small in your cabin. They blinked, shifted, weren't sure how to respond. She continued. Call it the Tilly Clause, a requirement that if a passenger is removed from an assigned seat without verified error or threat, that incident must be logged, reviewed, and if necessary investigated, with the passenger's own statement included. Unrealistic, one of them muttered. So was software that maps pedestrian traffic in real time, Amara replied, until I built it. Silence. And then, we'll consider it. That was all she needed. The days that followed weren't glamorous. They were full of quiet changes. One morning, she got a message from a junior engineer she'd mentored once. I read your internal memo. You didn't even name names, just rewired the whole issue. Quiet power, I felt that. Another message, this time from a retired Skylux employee. I used to keep notes of incidents like this. We weren't allowed to log them. You're not the first, but you might be the one who finally gets it heard. Amara saved each message in a folder labeled Echoes. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, she found herself at a cafe in downtown Charlotte, laptop open, headphones in, code scrolling slowly across the screen. She looked up. 2 women were standing by the window table, black, mid-30s, one in a nurse's scrubs, the other in business attire. They were watching her, not in awe, not with curiosity, but with recognition. The one in the blazer raised her cup slightly and said just loud enough to carry, "We saw your name in the board minutes. You're doing the work." Amara didn't know them, but she smiled, nodded. That was enough. She never asked for headlines. She didn't write a Medium piece. She didn't go on podcasts or panels. She just kept showing up. To meetings, to systems, to spaces that once asked her to prove she belonged. She no longer tried to fit. She designed new walls. And in doing so, she changed the shape of what belonging could mean. Not earned, not granted, inherent. 6 months later, Amara stood in a glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor of Skylux's corporate headquarters in Atlanta. There was no applause, no welcome banner, no press badge clipped to her blouse. But on the agenda for that morning's board review, printed on formal letterhead and passed to every executive at the table, one line stood alone under policy amendments. Proposal 18.7, the Tilly Clause. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. It had taken dozens of drafts, quiet resistance, and the subtle sidestepping of managers who thought bias was a marketing issue. But now it was here. In writing, before the board, visible, permanent. The clause was simple, but its presence said everything. Any involuntary reassignment of a passenger, based on manifest error, unverified suspicion, or staff discretion, must be accompanied by 1. Documentation, 2. Passenger testimony, and 3. Mandatory review. Failure to log such events results in procedural breach and initiates compliance audit. That was the legal language. But beneath it, the meaning was personal. No one gets moved without being seen. The room was still. No one said her name. But no one questioned the clause either. That was enough. It passed, quietly, unanimously. And Amara left that meeting without celebration, but with a freedom she hadn't felt since she first stepped onto Flight LT-Nate 104. This time, the seat was hers and no one had to check. Months later, Skylux's internal newsletter featured a small paragraph at the bottom of page 3. Compliance Reform Update. The Tilly Clause has been formally adopted as part of Skylux's Passenger Respect and Equity Initiative. We thank contributors for helping shape a more just experience for all. There was no photo, no interview, no quote. But Amara didn't need recognition. She had something stronger. She had reach. That winter, she flew to San Diego for a product launch. She boarded late-weather delay sand, expected the usual sideways glances. Instead, the flight attendant smiled, scanned her pass, and said, "Welcome, Miss Tilly, row 3C aisle." She paused. "You know my name?" The attendant leaned in slightly. "They added your clause to our protocol training. We had to read case studies. Yours was one of them." "Oh," Amara said quietly. "Just so you know," the woman added, "it's helping." Later on that same flight, a man was nearly reassigned after his name didn't appear on the tablet manifest. But this time, something shifted. The flight attendant held up a printed manifest, double-checked, asked for ID, and apologized. No drama, no escalation, just process done right. Somewhere in Detroit, a young woman named Kennedy training to be a flight attendant sat in her onboarding seminar, watching a 5-minute video clip labeled Passenger Misidentification, 804, Case Review. The footage was grainy, interior cabin view, a calm voice-up passenger being asked to move. Kennedy didn't know the full story, but the woman's stillness stayed with her. So did the name Tilly. Across the country, at a local community college in Durham, a professor teaching ethics in design used Amara's open-source documentation to show how one small failure of verification could reflect systemic neglect. He didn't mention race in the first slide, but by the third, his students brought it up themselves. Because the truth always finds shape once you leave space for it. Amara never returned to seat 9C. She didn't need to, because that seat had become more than a number. It had become a line in policy, a new default, a question future flight attendants would have to ask. Have I verified? Have I assumed? What would I do differently if this was written down? And now, it was. At her own company, Amara quietly implemented an internal review of candidate screening protocols, subtle phrases in hiring software that filtered out applicants based on cultural fit were redefined. HR forms were rewritten, interview rubrics restructured. Not loudly, not performatively, just corrected. Because systemic bias rarely comes in shouting. It whispers, and it lives in defaults. She started rewriting them, one line at a time. One day, she took her mother's old silver ring to a jeweler and had it resized. Engraved on the inside, not forgotten. She wore it on the days she walked into rooms that still tried to shrink her. Not as armor, but as a reminder. That memory is not just what we carry. It's what we rewrite when we refuse to go silent. And then came the invitation she didn't expect. Not from Skylux, not from a tech firm, but from a public high school in Baltimore. A teacher there had read the internal report that leaked to a civil rights education group. She'd used it in her civic engagement class. The students wanted to meet Amara. They called her the woman who made flying safer. Amara nearly declined. She wasn't interested in being a figurehead, but something about the timing felt right. She stood in the school auditorium in front of 50 students. She told them the story not as a battle, but as a series of decisions. Each time she could have walked away. Each time she chose not to. She didn't dramatize. She didn't posture. She just spoke plainly about how small actions turn into echoes, how quiet doesn't mean weak, and how systems don't change because we yell. They change because we document, we challenge, and we don't give up just because we're tired. A student raised his hand. Did you ever want to just scream at them? Amara smiled. Every day, but screaming ends when the noise fades. Policy that stays. On the flight home, the plane was nearly empty. She chose a window seat. No one asked her to move. But halfway through the flight, a flight attendant approached and said, "I just wanted to thank you. When we covered your claws in training, it hit different. My mom's a cleaner at the airport. She's always felt unseen. What you did, it mattered to her. Even though she'll never sit in business class." Amara didn't say anything right away. Just reached up and tightened her seatbelt. Then, quietly, "Tell her I see her." That night, she opened the folder on her laptop. Echoes. She added one more message. The silence I carried used to feel like a burden. Now it sounds like resolve. Legacy doesn't always come with spotlight. Sometimes it's a line in a policy binder. A changed protocol. A student raising their hand with better questions. A seat no longer denied. A whisper that turns into a decision. Amara Tilly didn't build her legacy with noise. She built it with quiet clarity. And now, everywhere her name was once overlooked, it's printed, logged, referenced, not because she asked for it, but because she made the room impossible to enter without it. Have you ever been in a space you worked hard to reach, only to be made to feel like you didn't belong there? Not by words, but by glances, hesitations, assumptions. Because if you have, then you know it's not the seat that hurts, it's the silence that follows. But what if we told you that silence doesn't have to be the end of the story? Amara didn't fight for recognition. She stood for respect. And she proved that quiet dignity can shake the ground beneath the very system that tried to shrink her. So, if you're listening to this and carrying your own version of Seat 9C, don't let them fold you into invisibility. You do belong, and your presence exactly as at ISIS, more powerful than you think. We'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt like Amara? Share your story in the comments. And if this episode moved you, send it to someone who might need to hear it too. And of course, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next journey we take together. Memory is not just what we carry, it's what we rewrite when we refuse to go silent. We've got more stories that heal, awaken, and remind us who we are. Stay tuned.